In previous videos, we looked at the history of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. We explored the factors that led to the revolution, including rising debt and inflation, the success of the United States in getting its independence from Britain, and how the ideas of the Enlightenment were used by the proponents of the revolution. We also looked at how the backdrop of the revolution allowed for the rise of a young Napoleon Bonaparte. For a number of reasons, which we will explore in today's video, Napoleon has become a controversial figure, and today we will deliver a verdict, hero or villain, which was Napoleon. Let's start with the good. In his time as first consul in 1804, one of the key achievements of Napoleon was his enactment of the Napoleonic Code, a document which recognized the principles of civil liberty and equality before the law, well, at least for men. The code was a comprehensive reformation of French civil laws. It replaced previous local laws, which were often fragmented, with a mix of Roman, feudal, and common customs of the past, depending on which part of France you were in. This document reflected many of the ideas that fueled the revolution, such as liberty and equality before the law. As a feudal society, pre-revolutionary France, as well as much of Europe, had laws which granted special rights and privileges to the elite. For one, property rights skewed heavily to the benefit of the land-owning class, who often had peasants working their land. These peasants paid rents and taxes, but were often not rewarded for their labor. Secondly, the third estate, that is, the common people, shouldered most of the tax burden despite having less wealth. The code dealt with laws concerning people, property and the acquisition of property, the protection of personal property rights, and the equality of men before the law were key developments. The adoption of the laws in this document led to the end of feudalism in France, or at least what was left of it after the revolution. Another achievement of Napoleon was his contribution to the development of France's institutions, including a central bank and a number of academic centers. The Bank of France would play a vital role in helping France pay its debt post-revolution. The works of scholars, such as those who discovered the Rosetta Stone, would contribute significantly to the body of human knowledge. But before we continue, a side note on why the Rosetta Stone was so important. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by French engineers during their Egyptian campaign. The stone itself is estimated to have been written in the 2nd century. Carved into the stone was a priestly decree affirming the king's deeds, such as the reduction of taxes, and in return for his deeds, he would be honored with statues and celebrations. The decree also states that the decree should be written and put in all important temples within Egypt. The most important thing about the Rosetta Stone was it having the exact same piece of text in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Ancient Greek. Researchers already understood Ancient Greek, and this allowed us to translate hieroglyphs, and this allowed us also to have a better understanding of Egyptian culture. Yet another credit to Napoleon was his military achievements. Known as one of the greatest military strategists ever, Napoleon had spent his formative years at the French Military Academy. On the battlefield, his strategies involved maneuvering, flanking, and isolating opposing forces. Time and again, this proved to be very useful, with the Duke of Wellington famously saying that Napoleon's presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 men. And despite suggestions that he was a warmonger, to his merits, some would say he only started 2 wars, the Iberian War and the Russian War. The other wars were either launched preemptively or started by his enemies, who he successfully stopped from invading France. Another one of his achievements was bringing stability to the tumultuous French government through a coup in November 1799. And now, let's consider arguments that he was a villain. After leaving his troops behind in Egypt in 1799, Napoleon ended the First Republic, seized control of France, and proclaimed himself first consul. In 1802, he held a national referendum allowing him to be called first consul for life. And even though he was yet to have any children, he legislated for his future son to be his successor. This had the added effect of disincentivizing any assassinations. To further consolidate power, he approved the results of a referendum which showed that nearly 99% of the population approved of his consulship, which would come as no surprise given that each voter wrote their name and address on the vote. And so, in 1804, after a series of victories on the battlefield, he was crowned emperor that's Julius Caesar. And so in 1804, after a series of victories on the battlefield, he was crowned emperor of the French Empire. His coronation was seen as an affront to the Holy Roman Empire. His crown had Roman symbols, and in a ceremony attended by the Pope Pius VII, after being anointed with oil, he placed the crown on his own head. He then crowned his wife, Josephine, Empress of France, and gave other family members titles. All of this so far are straight out of the playbook for many tyrants. French expansionism under Napoleon violated the sovereignty of neighbouring territories and intruded on local customs of the annexed territories. In the process of carrying out his Italian campaigns, he also looted works of art including paintings and sculptures from the Vatican City and Venice. In addition, Napoleon set about making France somewhat of a police state. With the help of his Minister of Police, he suppressed criticisms of his actions with the use of spies, as he asserted control over many aspects of society. During his rise to power, he had relied on a free press in shaping his image. Once he was emperor, he established an organization responsible for overseeing the publishing and printing of writings, subjecting them to scrutiny before publishing. Another point worth mentioning was his decision to reintroduce slavery into the French colonies in 1802, 8 years after it had been abolished. And although his code instituted several positive reforms in French society in line with the Enlightenment principles, its patriarchal nature also placed the man as the head of the family unit, making women the property of their husbands. So there you have it, the good and the bad. We see the rise of a young general, from his battlefield victories, quelling of royalist uprisings, to an eventual coup of the French Directory. Napoleon was clearly a product of a tumultuous period in French history. But without Napoleon, what would have been the fate of France? Would neighbouring countries have invaded, and whilst squashing the revolution, taken bits of France for themselves? Or would the revolution-weary France have simply allowed for the reinstatement of a monarchy? After all, much of Europe still had monarchies at the time. So what is the verdict? Hero or villain? In my humble opinion, weighing up the points I've put forward, Napoleon falls within the villain category. Many of his actions are indicative of an authoritarian. Suppression of the press, consolidation of power, opposition to democracy, these are all things you would see a tyrant do. I would also go as far as question the merits of some of his so-called good deeds. His code, for one, was not empowering of women. His wins on the battlefield cost millions of young men's lives. This was especially true in the Iberian and Russian wars. Spain and Russia, who had initially welcomed him, then began to resist him as his regime became more expansionist and authoritarian. Napoleon's dedication to Enlightenment and revolutionary principles only went so far as promoting equality for men in France, with women and slaves not being seen as equal. The principles of liberty, equality and fraternity meant little to him as he enriched his family and essentially created a new aristocracy. But what do the French people think of him today? My opinion aside, Napoleon remains a controversial figure. His supporters herald him as a saviour of France, and his detractors push for a focus on French history that dwells less on the feats of revolutionary France but more on its industrial revolution.